I lasted exactly 3 hours as Mrs. Voss before my husband asked for a divorce. The sentence still echoes in my head like it belongs to someone else, someone weaker, someone who didn't see it coming. But I remember every second with terrifying clarity. The way the chandelier light fractured across the marble floor, the weight of the ring still unfamiliar on my finger, the faint scent of white roses clinging to my dress like a promise that had already expired. I thought I understood what I was walking into when I married Adrian Voss, a man whose name alone could silence a room, a man who never raised his voice because he never had to, a man who could buy anything except the one thing I thought we were building tonight. The ceremony had been flawless, the kind of wedding people whisper about for years: tailored suits, crystal glasses, a skyline view that stretched for miles, everything precise, controlled, perfect, just like him. And yet there was a moment, small and quiet, when his hand slipped from mine a second too early, when his eyes didn't linger the way they should have, and I felt it, a crack beneath the surface, something cold moving under something beautiful. I ignored it because I wanted to believe in the version of this story where the girl gets chosen and the powerful man finally feels something real, because that's what everyone told me this was: a new beginning, a union, a future sealed in golden vows. But Adrian never kissed me like a man in love. He kissed me like a man closing a deal. Hours later, when the guests were gone and the music had faded into silence, I stood in a room that felt too large, too quiet, watching him loosen his tie with slow, deliberate movements. And I remember thinking how calm he looked, how untouched he seemed by everything that had just happened, as if the wedding was something he had attended, not something he had lived. Then he said it, not loud, not angry, just controlled, precise, like every word had been measured long before this moment. We need a divorce. I didn't understand at first because my mind refused to catch up with the reality of what I had just heard, because people don't end marriages before the night even ends, because vows are supposed to mean something, because I was still wearing the dress, still holding on to the illusion that this was real. I asked him why, my voice barely steady, and he looked at me the way he had all night, like he was studying something he couldn't afford to feel, and then he said the words that hollowed everything out from the inside. I loved someone else. Not love, past tense, not confusion, not regret, just a fact, delivered without hesitation, like it explained everything. But it didn't. Because if he loved someone else, then why marry me? Why stand there and say those words? Why look at me the way he did when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like there was something there he was trying to bury? I should have broken right then, should have cried or screamed or demanded answers. But all I felt was stillness, a strange, quiet kind of clarity settling in my chest, because something about this didn't fit. Something about him didn't match the story he was telling. And as he turned away like the conversation was already over, like I was already part of his past, I realized something far more dangerous than heartbreak. Adrian Voss wasn't done with me. He was just pretending to let me go. I did not move when he said it. Not right away, because movement would have made it real, and as long as I stayed still, I could pretend this was just another test, another calculated moment in a world where nothing happened without purpose. But the silence stretched too long, heavy and deliberate, and I could feel it pressing against my chest until breathing itself felt like a decision I had to make carefully, consciously, as if even that could be taken away if I was not careful. He walked past me like I was part of the room, like I had already been removed from his life in some quiet, efficient way, his footsteps soft against the polished floor, controlled, measured, and I watched him the way you watch something dangerous from a distance, not because you want to, but because you cannot afford to look away. There was no hesitation in him, no second glance, no trace of doubt, and that was what unsettled me the most, not the words themselves, but how easily he carried them, how naturally they fit into the space between us like they had always been there, waiting. I turned slowly, my fingers brushing against the edge of the table just to feel something solid, something real, because everything else felt like it was slipping through me, and I forced my voice to work even though it felt foreign in my own throat. Then why did you marry me? The question came out quieter than I expected, but it held, steady enough to reach him, and for a moment, just a moment, he paused. It was subtle, barely noticeable, the kind of hesitation most people would miss, but I saw it. The slight tightening in his shoulders, the almost imperceptible shift in his stance, and it told me more than any answer could have. He had not expected me to ask that. He turned back, his expression unreadable, the same calm mask he had worn all night, but his eyes were different now, darker, more focused, like he was reassessing something he thought he had already solved. Because it was necessary, he said, and the words landed harder than anything else, not because they were cruel, but because they were clean, stripped of emotion, stripped of anything that could be argued with or challenged. Necessary. Like I was a step in a process. Like this was never about us at all. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I needed him to keep talking, needed to understand the rules of a game I had been pulled into without consent, because people like Adrian Voss did not do anything without a reason, and if I was part of that reason, then I needed to know why. And now it is not. I asked, and this time, he did not answer right away. He studied me, really studied me, his gaze tracing over my face like he was searching for something he had lost, something he was not sure he wanted to find again, and for a second, the air shifted, something fragile and dangerous threading through the space between us, something that did not belong in a conversation about endings. It is complicated, he said finally, and it was the first time his voice had changed, just slightly, just enough to break the perfect control he had maintained until now. Complicated was not a word men like him used unless it mattered. I took a step closer before I could stop myself, the distance between us shrinking in a way that felt risky, like crossing an invisible line I did not understand yet. You said you loved someone else, I said, holding his gaze, refusing to look away, because if he could stand there and dismantle everything we had just built, then he could at least face me while he did it. So tell me her name. The question hung there, sharp and undeniable, and this time, he did not answer at all. His silence was not empty. It was full, heavy with something unspoken, something that did not fit the version of the truth he had given me. And that was when I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that whatever this was, whatever story he was trying to close, it was not over, not for him, and definitely not for me. He did not say her name, and that silence told me more than any confession ever could, because men like Adrian Voss did not hesitate unless there was something worth protecting, and whatever he was protecting, it was not me, at least not in the way a husband was supposed to protect his wife. I watched his jaw tighten just slightly, the only crack in the perfect control he carried like a second skin, and I realized then that I had stepped into something deeper than rejection, something layered, deliberate, something that had been set in motion long before I ever walked down that aisle. You cannot ask about her, he said finally, his voice low, steady, but there was an edge to it now, something sharper than before, like the conversation had crossed into territory he did not intend to reveal. Cannot. Not will not. Not do not. Cannot. The words settled into me slowly, unfolding in a way that made my pulse pick up, because it meant there were rules here, rules I had not been told, rules that mattered enough for him to draw a line even now, even after everything he had already taken from me tonight. I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, not quite disbelief, just something in between, because if this was supposed to end me, if this was supposed to make me walk away quietly, then he had miscalculated. You married me, I said, my voice steadier now, stronger than I expected, so I think I can ask whatever I want. His eyes flickered then, just for a second, something unreadable passing through them before it disappeared again, replaced by that same cold precision. But I had seen it, and once you see something like that, you cannot unsee it. He took a step closer, closing the distance between us in a way that made the air feel thinner, tighter, like the room itself was reacting to him, and I forced myself not to step back, not to give him that small victory, because I was beginning to understand that everything with him was measured, every reaction noted, every weakness catalogued. This marriage was an arrangement, he said, and now there was no softness left at all, just clarity, just truth delivered in the cleanest way possible, and arrangements have terms. I felt the words hit, but they did not break me the way they should have, because something else had already taken root, something stronger than hurt, something sharper than disappointment. Curiosity. Then what are the terms? I asked, and for the first time since this conversation began, he did not answer immediately, and that hesitation, that brief pause, it changed everything. Because it meant there was something he did not want to say, something he could not say. His gaze shifted, not away, but through me, like he was seeing something else layered over my face, something from a different time, a different place, and it was so subtle that I almost missed it. But once I noticed, I could not ignore it. He was not just looking at me. He was remembering something. Or someone. "You will remain here," he said finally, each word placed carefully, deliberately, like he was constructing something piece by piece, until everything is resolved. Remain. Not leave. Not go. Stay. The word wrapped around me in a way that felt less like a request and more like a decision that had already been made, and I felt a slow, steady realization settle into my chest. This was never about divorce. Not really. Because people who wanted to end something did not ask you to stay. They did not watch you like this. They did not hesitate when you asked the one question that mattered. I tilted my head slightly, studying him now the way he had been studying me, matching his stillness with my own, and I let the silence stretch just enough before I spoke again, softer this time, but far more certain. "You are not letting me go," I said, and it was not a question. His expression did not change, not visibly, but something in the air shifted again, something quiet and dangerous, something that made my heart beat slow instead of race, because I finally understood the one truth he had not said out loud. Adrian Voss did not ask for divorce because he loved someone else. He asked for it because loving me was not supposed to happen, and somewhere between the vows and the silence, it already had. He did not deny it, and that was how I knew I was right. Not because he confirmed it, but because Adrian Voss was not a man who tolerated assumptions unless they aligned with something he could not afford to correct, and the silence between us shifted again, no longer sharp, no longer cutting, but heavy, layered with something far more complicated than anger or rejection. I should have felt relieved or vindicated, or at least less broken than I had a few minutes ago, but instead, I felt something else entirely, something quieter and far more unsettling. Because if he was not letting me go, then this was not an ending. It was a beginning, and I had no idea what kind. "You said this was an arrangement," I continued, my voice steady even as my thoughts moved faster than I could fully catch them. "So what happens when arrangements do not go the way you planned?" His gaze held mine, unwavering. But there was something behind it now, something calculating in a different way, not cold, not distant, but almost cautious, as if I had stepped onto a path he had not prepared for. "They are corrected," he said, and the simplicity of the answer should have reassured me, should have made everything feel structured again, predictable, but it did the opposite, because nothing about this felt controlled anymore, not in the way he was used to. I took another step forward, closing the space until I could feel the faint warmth of him, the quiet presence that filled the room without effort, and I realized how strange it was that even now, even after everything he had said, I did not feel afraid of him, not truly, not in the way people were supposed to fear a man like him. "And what if I do not agree to your correction?" I asked, and this time, the pause was longer, more deliberate, stretching just enough to make the question matter. His eyes flickered again, not away, never away, but deeper, like he was looking past the surface of me, past the version of me he had expected, and into something he had not accounted for. "You will," he said quietly, and it was not a threat, not exactly, but it carried weight, certainty, the kind that came from a man who had never been wrong about people before. I let the words settle, felt them press against the edges of my thoughts, and for the first time since this night began, I understood the shape of what I was standing in. This was not just about him. It was about everything around him, the world that moved with him, the unseen structure that had brought me here and would not let me leave easily. "You keep saying things like that," I said softly, tilting my head just slightly, studying him the way he studied everything else. "Like you already know what I am going to do." Something changed then, something small but undeniable, the faintest shift in his expression, like a crack in glass that only appears when the light hits it just right. "I do," he replied, and there was no hesitation now, no pause, just certainty. And that should have frustrated me, should have made me push back harder, but instead, it made me curious in a way I could not ignore. Because if he believed that, if he was so sure of me, then it meant he had been watching, not just tonight, not just during the ceremony, but before that, longer than I realized. And that thought settled into me slowly, unfolding into something that felt less like coincidence and more like design. I glanced down at my hand, at the ring that still sat there, catching the light in a way that felt almost mocking now. And I wondered when exactly this had started, when I had stopped being just a woman in a white dress and become something else entirely, something tied to him in ways I did not yet understand. When I looked back up, he was already watching me, his attention sharp, focused, like he was waiting for something, waiting for me to reach the same conclusion he already had. "You are not asking me to stay," I said slowly, each word deliberate, measured. "You are expecting me to." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, charged with something unspoken, something that settled between us like a truth neither of us needed to say out loud. And in that moment, I realized something that shifted everything again, something that made the ground beneath this entire night feel less certain than before. I had thought I was the one trying to understand him, but the way he was looking at me now, steady, unblinking, almost searching, it felt like he was trying to understand me too. And that was far more dangerous than anything he had said so far. The way he looked at me did not change, but something beneath it did, something quieter, something that made the air feel different, like the room had shifted just slightly off balance and neither of us was willing to acknowledge it first. And I realized then that whatever control Adrian Voss believed he had in this moment, it was not as absolute as he wanted it to be. I should have been the one losing ground, the one unraveling, the one trying to piece together what had just been taken from me. But instead, I felt something steadier settling into place, something that did not belong to the girl who had walked down that aisle believing in a future that no longer existed. This was something else, something sharper. "You are used to people doing what you expect," I said quietly, not accusing, not challenging, just stating what had become obvious. And I watched the way his eyes narrowed ever so slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like he was recalibrating, adjusting to a version of me he had not planned for. "And you are used to being right," I added, my voice calm, even, because this was not about raising it, not about emotion it was about understanding the rules he lived by, the ones he thought applied to me. He did not interrupt. He did not dismiss it. He just watched, and that told me more than any response could have, because silence, with him, was never empty. It was a choice. "But I am not part of your system," I continued, taking a slow breath, grounding myself in the reality of this moment. "Not the way you think I am." The words settled between us, and for a second, something flickered in his expression again, something that looked dangerously close to interest, and that was when I understood the shift completely. This was no longer just about control. This was about curiosity. He took a step closer, closing the last bit of distance between us until I could feel the weight of his presence fully, steady, unwavering, like everything else about him. And yet there was something different now, something less certain beneath it. "You are here," he said, his voice low, measured, but not as detached as before, "which means you are already part of it." I shook my head slowly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, because this was the line, the one that mattered more than anything he had said about divorce or arrangements or expectations. "No," I said, just as quietly. "I am here because you brought me here, not because I chose it." The distinction mattered. It had to matter. Because if I let him define this entirely, if I let him decide what this meant without question, then I would disappear into it, into him, into whatever world he controlled so effortlessly, and I refused to let that happen, not without understanding why I was placed here in the first place. His jaw tightened again, but this time it was different, not irritation, not frustration, something more restrained, like he was holding back a response he was not ready to give. "Choice is a matter of perspective," he said after a moment, and the words were smooth, practiced, the kind of answer that worked in every situation because it never fully committed to one truth. But I could hear it now, the slight shift underneath, the subtle difference in tone that told me he was no longer entirely certain of how this would play out. I glanced at the door behind him, at the space that should have represented freedom, an exit, a way out of this situation that had become something far more complicated than it had any right to be. And for a brief second, I imagined walking through it, leaving this behind, reclaiming whatever version of my life existed before tonight. But the thought did not settle the way it should have. It did not feel like relief. It felt unfinished. I looked back at him, at the man who had tried to end something before it had even begun, and yet stood here now, not moving, not leaving, not closing the distance or creating more of it, just waiting, watching. If I leave, I said slowly, the words forming with a clarity that surprised even me. This ends exactly the way you planned. His eyes sharpened immediately, the reaction instant, undeniable, and I knew I had touched something real this time, something that mattered in a way the rest had not. I held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and let the next part come without hesitation. And I do not think you want that. The silence that followed was different from all the others, not heavy, not uncertain, but charged, alive with something neither of us had fully named yet. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything again. This was never just about him controlling the outcome. It was about him trying to avoid one. And somehow, without meaning to, I had just become the part of the story he could not predict. He did not respond immediately, and that was the first real confirmation I needed. Not words, not explanations, just the absence of them. Because a man like Adrian Voss did not pause unless something had shifted beyond his control, and I could see it now. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to know that whatever outcome he had planned for tonight, it no longer fit the reality standing in front of him. His gaze stayed locked on mine, steady, unblinking, but there was something beneath it now, something that had not been there before, something that felt less like authority and more like calculation in real time, like he was adjusting to a version of the story he had not written. You assume too much, he said finally, his voice even, controlled, but quieter than before, like he was choosing each word more carefully now, and that alone told me everything had changed. I let a small breath out, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like one, because for the first time since this night began, I was not reacting to him, I was reading him. No, I said softly, I am just paying attention. The silence that followed stretched, but it was different now, not something pressing down on me, not something suffocating, but something balanced, something that belonged to both of us equally. And I realized then that this was no longer just his conversation to control. He moved then, not away, not toward me, but to the side, his hand brushing lightly against the back of a chair as he repositioned himself, a subtle shift that opened the space instead of closing it. And I caught the meaning immediately. He was giving me room, not as a dismissal, as a decision. You can leave if you want, he said, and the words were simple, almost casual, but they landed with a weight that felt anything but, because this was the first time he had offered something that sounded like a choice. I did not move. I did not even look toward the door this time, because I already knew what it represented, and more importantly, I knew what it did not. Freedom was not something given in a sentence like that, not from a man like him. That is not true, I replied quietly, meeting his gaze again, steady, certain, because I understood this part now, the layer beneath the words, the intention behind them. His expression did not change, but his attention sharpened, and I knew he was listening in a way that mattered. If I leave, I walk out of something I do not understand. I continued, my voice calm, controlled, matching his in a way that felt almost instinctive now. And you do not strike me as someone who leaves things unfinished. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, not quite anything easily defined, but it was there, a reaction he had not intended to show, and it sent a quiet realization through me like a ripple. I was right. He did not deny it. He did not correct me. He just watched. And in that stillness, I saw it again. That same flicker, that same trace of something deeper than control, something that did not belong to the man who had asked for a divorce hours after a wedding, something that felt dangerously close to conflict. You are staying, he said after a moment, and this time, it was not framed as an expectation, not softened into suggestion, just stated, clear and direct, and I should have felt trapped, should have resisted it, pushed back, demanded the choice he had just pretended to offer, but instead, I felt something else settle into place. Not fear, not even defiance, understanding, because this was not about keeping me here. It was about not letting something else happen if I left. I took a slow breath, letting the weight of that realization sink in, letting it shape the next words before I spoke them, because this was the part that mattered, the part where everything shifted from reaction to intention. Then stop pretending this is about divorce, I said, my voice low but steady, cutting clean through everything he had tried to frame this as since the beginning. And for the first time, truly the first time, Adrian Voss did not have an immediate answer. The silence that followed was not controlled. It was real. And in that moment, I knew something with absolute certainty. Whatever he was trying to protect, whatever truth he was holding just out of reach, it was no longer just his to keep. The silence did not break right away, and this time it was different from every other pause we had shared tonight, because it was no longer controlled, no longer shaped by him. It simply existed, raw and unstructured, filling the space between us with something that felt too real to ignore, and I watched him carefully, not for what he said, but for what he did not. Adrian Voss did not struggle for words, not ever, and yet here he was, standing still, his gaze fixed on me like he was measuring something that refused to fit into the framework he had built his life on, and I realized then that whatever truth I had just touched, it was not small. It was the center of everything. "You think you understand this," he said finally, his voice lower now, quieter, stripped of the sharp edges it had carried before, but there was something else in it, something heavier, something that felt dangerously close to honesty. I did not answer right away. I let the moment sit, let the weight of his words settle before I spoke, because this was no longer about reacting quickly, it was about choosing precisely. "No," I said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I think you are trying to make sure I do not." His jaw tightened again, but this time it was not resistance, it was restraint, like he was holding something back, something that had already begun to surface whether he wanted it to or not. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the shift, enough to signal that whatever came next would not be as carefully constructed as everything before it. "There are things you are safe for not knowing," he said, and the words should have sounded like a warning, should have pushed me back, created distance, but instead, they did the opposite, because safety had never been part of this night. "Not from the moment I said yes to a man like him. You do not get to decide that for me." I replied softly, not raising my voice, not pushing, just stating the one truth he could not dismiss. And for a second, something flickered across his face again, something sharper this time, something that looked almost like frustration, but it faded just as quickly as it appeared. He stepped closer then, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to close the space again, and I felt it, the shift in the air, the quiet intensity that followed him wherever he moved, but I did not step back. Not this time. "If you knew," he said, his voice lower now, almost a murmur, "you would not have walked down that aisle." The words landed differently than everything else he had said tonight, not cold, not detached, but heavy, layered with something that felt uncomfortably close to truth, and I felt a slow, steady realization begin to take shape in my chest, something that connected every piece of this night in a way I had not seen before. "Then why did you let me?" I asked, and this time, there was no hesitation in my voice at all, just clarity, because this was the question that mattered, the one that cut through everything else he had tried to frame this as. His gaze held mine, unwavering, but there was no easy answer in it, no clean explanation waiting behind his silence, just something complicated and unresolved, something that did not belong to a man who controlled everything. "Because stopping you would have made it worse," he said finally, and the answer was not what I expected, not simple, not complete, but real enough to matter. Worse. The word echoed in my mind, expanding, connecting to everything else he had refused to say, everything he had carefully avoided, and for the first time, I understood that this was not just about him avoiding something. It was about him trying to contain it. I took a slow breath, letting that realization settle fully before I spoke again, because this was the moment where everything shifted from confusion into something far more deliberate. "This is not about someone else," I said quietly, watching him closely, tracking every subtle reaction, every flicker of expression he tried to hide. "It is about something that connects to me." His eyes sharpened instantly, the reaction immediate, undeniable, and I knew I had crossed into the truth now, not fully, not completely, but enough to feel its shape, enough to know I was no longer guessing. The silence that followed was not empty. It was confirmation. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything again. I was not standing at the end of a marriage. I was standing at the beginning of a secret he had never intended to share. He did not interrupt me, and that was how I knew I had stepped directly into the truth, not the version he had been offering, not the one shaped by careful omissions and controlled language, but something deeper, something that had been sitting beneath every word he chose not to say. And for the first time since this night began, I saw it clearly in his eyes, not just calculation, not just control, but conflict. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. But I was looking now, fully, completely, because this was no longer about surviving the moment. It was about understanding it. "You should stop," he said quietly, and the words were not a command, not sharp or forceful, but something else entirely, something closer to a warning than anything he had given me before, and that alone made me certain I could not. I shook my head slowly, holding his gaze, refusing to let him redirect this again. Not now. Not when everything was finally beginning to make sense in a way that felt both terrifying and necessary. "You said I would not have walked down that aisle if I knew." I continued, my voice steady, each word placed carefully. "So whatever this is, it is not about protecting me from the truth. It is about protecting something else." His jaw tightened again, more visibly this time, and I felt the shift immediately, the tension in the air sharpening, but not in a way that pushed me back, in a way that pulled me forward, deeper into whatever he had been trying to keep contained. He turned slightly then, just enough to break the direct line of our gaze, and for a moment, I thought he might walk away. In this conversation the way he had tried to end everything else tonight, cleanly, efficiently, without leaving anything behind to question. But he did not. He stayed. And that was the answer. I took a step closer, closing the space again, because distance no longer felt like safety, it felt like avoidance, and I had no intention of allowing that anymore. "It is connected to me," I said, softer now, but more certain than ever, because every reaction he gave me, every silence, every pause, it all pointed back to the same place. Me. His eyes snapped back to mine instantly, sharp, focused, and this time there was no hiding it, no mask strong enough to cover the truth that had just surfaced, and for a second, just a second, I saw something I had not seen before. Not control, not calculation, something far more human. "You do not understand what you are asking," he said, and his voice had changed again, lower, rougher at the edges, like the effort to keep everything contained was beginning to strain, and that told me more than anything else could have. I was not asking the wrong question. I was asking the only one that mattered. "Then explain it," I replied, not pushing, not demanding, just holding the space open in a way he could not easily close. And the silence that followed was heavier than any before it, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something waiting, something that had reached the point where it could not remain hidden much longer. He exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but not entirely steady, and for the first time, I realized that this was not just difficult for him. It was personal. 10 years ago, he began, and the words alone were enough to shift everything again, to pull the moment out of the present and anchor it somewhere deeper, somewhere older, somewhere that had been shaping this night long before it ever happened. There was an incident. He stopped there, just long enough to make the word feel heavier than it should have, like it carried more meaning than it was allowed to show, and I felt my pulse pick up, not from fear, but from recognition, from the sense that I was standing at the edge of something that had been waiting for me without my knowledge. "Someone was taken from me," he continued, his gaze steady but distant now, like he was seeing something else entirely, something that existed beyond this room, beyond this moment, and I felt it then, the connection forming, the pieces aligning in a way that made everything else fall into place with quiet, undeniable precision. I did not interrupt. I did not move. I just listened, because this was the part where everything changed. "And you," he said finally, his eyes returning to mine with a clarity that felt almost too sharp to hold. "You are the only person who has ever looked at me the same way she did." The words settled into the space between us, soft but absolute, and for a moment, everything went still, completely still, like the world itself had paused just long enough for the truth to land. And in that silence, I understood something that made everything else feel insignificant in comparison. This was never about losing someone else. This was about finding something again. And somehow, impossibly, that something was me. For a moment, I could not breathe, not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had shifted too suddenly, too completely, like a piece of a puzzle I did not know I was part of had just been placed without my permission, and now I could not unsee the picture it formed. I searched his face, not for the power he wore so effortlessly, not for the control he had built his world on, but for the truth behind what he had just said, and it was there, unmistakable, not loud, not overwhelming, but steady, rooted in something far older than tonight. "You were saying I remind you of her," I said quietly, the words careful, measured, because they needed to be right, needed to match the weight of what he had just given me. And he did not correct me, but he did not fully agree either, and that hesitation mattered more than anything else. "No," he replied after a moment, his voice lower now, more grounded, like he had crossed a line he could not step back from. "I am saying you are the only one who makes me question whether she is truly gone." The distinction settled into me slowly, deeper than I expected, because it was not about resemblance, not about memory. It was about something unresolved, something unfinished, something that had followed him for 10 years and now stood between us like an invisible thread neither of us could cut. I looked down at my hands for a second, at the ring that still rested there, no longer just a symbol of a broken promise, but something else entirely, something tied to a past I had never lived but somehow had been pulled into. And when I looked back up, everything felt different. Clearer. "That is why you asked for the divorce," I said softly, not as a question, but as a realization, because it all fit now, the timing, the distance, the way he had tried to end this before it could become anything more. His gaze sharpened, but he did not deny it. He never denied the truth once it was spoken correctly. "If I keep you close," he said, each word deliberate, controlled but no longer detached, "I will start to see what I want to see instead of what is real." I felt the words settle into me, not as rejection, not as dismissal, but as something far more complicated, something that acknowledged the space between who I was and what he feared I might become in his mind. "And if you let me go," I replied, my voice just as steady, just as deliberate, "you lose whatever this is before you understand it." The silence that followed was not heavy. It was balanced, equal, like we had both reached the same point from different directions and now stood there together, neither ahead, neither behind. He stepped closer then, not with authority, not with control, but with intention, and I felt it immediately. The difference in the way the space between us changed, no longer something he managed, but something we shared. "You should leave," he said again. But this time, the words carried something else, not expectation, not certainty, but something closer to conflict, like he was offering me the choice he had not truly given before. I held his gaze, steady, unshaken, because I understood now that this was the moment that mattered, the one where everything could still split into two completely different paths. "No," I said simply, and the word felt stronger than anything else I had said tonight, because it was the first one that belonged entirely to me. His expression did not change immediately, but something in his eyes did, something quiet and undeniable, like a shift in gravity that neither of us could ignore anymore. "Then understand this," he said, his voice low, controlled, but no longer distant. "This does not end cleanly." I nodded once, slow, certain, because I had known that the moment he chose to tell me the truth. "It already did not," I replied, and for the first time, truly the first time, something in his expression softened, not fully, not enough to call it anything simple, but enough to feel real. The kind of real that does not disappear when the moment ends. And as the silence settled around us again, no longer sharp, no longer uncertain, I realized something that felt both dangerous and undeniable. He could have ended this tonight. He tried to, but instead, he gave me a reason to stay. And somehow, without meaning to, I had given him one too.